I want you to imagine the most insane, grueling, longest boxing match you've ever seen. Two men who couldn't beat each other. A war that just wouldn't end. But what if I told you that whatever you're thinking of for the toughest match in history is nothing in comparison to a fight that went down in New Orleans in 1893? A fight between two immovable objects that stretched on for over 7 hours. I'm Bayliun, and this is the insane story of the longest fight in boxing history. We're going to go on a bit of a historical journey with this one, so let me just set some ground rules, because boxing in the 1890s was a far cry from the 12-round and often gloved sport that we know today. The introduction of the Marquis of Queensberry's rules was still relatively new at this time, older bare-knuckle traditions were still very much alive, and even the gloves themselves were pretty primitive. The technology hadn't really come far and was often just, thin leather mitts with minimal padding. Fighters wore little protection otherwise. You can forget mouthguards, groin shield, many bouts had no fixed round limits, essentially going on until one man was knocked out or couldn't continue. Stopping a dangerous fight wasn't really something the doctors were that concerned about, apparently. And you also have to imagine that legally, and culturally, prize fighting was barely tolerated in most places. Sometimes it was outright illegal or only semi-legal, tied to the underground world, gambling, rowdy crowds. But down in New Orleans, things were slightly different. The city had become a boxing hotspot by the early 1890s, fitting in well with the party atmosphere of its late night scene, and the city openly sanctioned gloved boxing in 1890, in what I'd say was a sensible attempt to shed this outlaw image. And as a result of this, a place that became pretty famous was the Olympic Club in New Orleans, a place where now it was less frowned upon. High society businessmen hosted matches as these grand sporting events. Now, by your modern standards, these events were still, absolutely brutal. Like I said, no time limits, 4-hour-long fights, and stylistically, that involved a lot more clinching, tactics to wear the other man down. Boxing skill was important, but not as important as having a hard head and an unbreakable will. There weren't really any professionals. These boxers were blacksmiths, farmers who would occasionally get themselves into these absurd marathon fights, but none of them compared to what happened on that fateful night in 1893. A blacksmith by day, Andy Bowen was a local boxer called by some at the time the Iron Man of the South. Absolutely amazing nickname. Andy was the local hero. Born and raised in New Orleans, Bowen had won several fights and was known as a lightweight contender whose grit and near superhuman durability was already legendary. Maybe all that blacksmithing had just turned him into one big muscle. Andy had earned the regional title in New Orleans and was absolutely beloved by its spectators as a bloke who would never quit in these brutal contests. By 25 years old, he had 15 wins and already several lengthy battles under his belt at the Olympic Club. In fact, the fights at the club had gotten so popular that challengers started coming from the neighboring states in the US, including one such contender by the name of the Texas Cyclone, Jack Burke. Slightly younger at 24, Burke had already travelled the southwest of America, taking on all kinds of challenges, earning for himself a rep as a relentless fighter who pushed forward a real hard, charging style with tons of Texan pride that had gotten him the nickname. And he'd already racked up a ton of experience fighting anyone he basically could. Now, Bowen had booked himself to actually fight Jack Burke's trainer at the Olympic Club, but when his coach pulled out at the last minute, or maybe that was the plan all along, Jack stepped up to take his spot and fight Andy. The promoters knew what they had on their hands with a local hero and travelling road warrior, and so they made the fight a showdown for the lightweight championship of the South, and as well as that, a winner-takes-all purse of $2,500. Might not sound like much, but that was a huge sum at the time. Combine that with a belt on the line, and both men had something to prove. This was a recipe for the most grueling boxing fight of all time. The promoters had been absolutely correct about it being a spectacle. Reports on the event and eyewitnesses say there were as many as 8,000 to 11,000 people packed into the Olympic Club. Lots of local fans, but also apparently many people travelled in to watch this fight. The Olympic Club was certainly doing its job of bringing the sport to the mainstream. Southern pride was on the line for both men, but little did anyone know what they were about to witness. At 9 o'clock that night, illuminated by gaslights and a packed house of 1,800 socialites and plebeians, the two men came to blows for the first time. The early rounds dominated by Burke, who was the sharper boxer, who was also apparently the favourite, and he dropped Bowen early. But what had made Bowen a contender was his insane durability. He got back up and put a beating on Burke, dropping him back. What followed was an absolute brutal slugfest that drew on to the 25th round, where it looked like it might finally be over. Bowen nailed Burke with a hard shot that dropped him, and everyone thought it was basically it. But as the ref started his 10 count, the bell rang, saving Burke and continuing the most incredible fight anyone had seen. Fights of our modern era never go this long. but this fight was just getting started. As it drew past the 30th round, it turned into something else entirely. Now a test of endurance and heart. Their pace impossible to contain, both men slowed down, and by round 40 they were barely standing but still trading blows after hundreds of punches already. As round 50 came, the clock struck midnight, and incredibly, the spectators and fans were actually getting bored by this point. And there were reports of some people leaving before the fight was over because it was showing no signs of stopping anytime soon. Some had even apparently fallen asleep in their seats, not unlike some of those UK UFC shows these days. One writer even said, soon the only 3 people interested in the fight seemed to be the 2 warriors and the referee. But at the same time, the promoters and bettors were in a bit of a bind. Huge sums of money were on the line, the $2,500 purse, it all hung in the balance and neither man was willing to forfeit. There was even a point where the referee stepped in, stopped the fight and offered to call it a draw and have them split the purse, but the unbreakable Bowen just smiled through all the blood and refused to accept a draw. This was his home, New Orleans, and he was not about to quit. The fight continued until the early hours of the morning. This was no longer a boxing match. This was a true test of endurance, an epic feat of human survival. David Goggins can take a lap, honestly. By the 75th round, both men were utterly battered and dehydrated. They had now been fighting for nearly 4 hours straight, their faces destroyed, their bodies broken. Burke had broken the bones in both his hands from countless punches, not surprising at all. One account noted a bone was even protruding from the skin of one of his hands. Yet he kept throwing punches. It's even said that Burke's corner resorted to injecting cocaine into his hands to numb the pain and allow him to continue. Of course, Bowen was exhausted as well, especially after he took a beating early, and observers noticed that he was staggering on his feet, basically fighting on pure instinct. Still, the thought of quitting, of letting the other one win, was just not in either of these guys' heads. By round 80, it wasn't even a fight, it was just totally surreal. The referee himself was exhausted and had to tag out for another ref. As the fight entered the 100th round, they'd been boxing for 7 hours. From here out, the 2 men would just pour each other with feeble jabs and circle each other, just too dazed and exhausted to mount a proper attack. They made it 8 more rounds this way before the ref finally said, if one of you doesn't win in the next 2, I'm calling this thing. Neither man had a knockout blow left in him, and after the 110th round, the referee stopped it, calling it a no contest with both men still standing. Dawn was breaking in New Orleans as a blood-stricken Bowen and Burke were carried out of the ring. They stood for 7 hours and 20 minutes, 110 rounds, and neither man had been finished. That $2,500 was eventually split between them, but Bowen, being made of stone as he was carried away, said he'd been robbed of a victory. The extent of their injuries was shocking, albeit not that surprising. Burke had the worst of it. Both of his hands were shattered. His boxing career derailed, but he did come back and fight a few more times in the 1890s. But his hands never properly healed. He suffered permanent damage and passed away at 44 about 20 years later. Bowen, on the other hand, emerged in better shape. Apart from some bruises and a cut over his eye, he was just banged up. In fact, Bowen even returned to the ring 2 months later, and that fight went 85 rounds, another 5.5 hours. And Bowen won that one when his opponent couldn't continue. Imagine thinking that's normal for your boxing career. But he definitely proved the nickname, the Iron Man of the South, was no exaggeration. Sadly though, he became a cautionary tale in another way. During a contest just 2 years later, he was knocked down to the canvas, a canvas that was mainly hardwood, and tragically, he never woke up, passing from a brain injury at just 27. He was a hero in New Orleans though, but his death was considered pretty haunting. After all, he'd endured a night of 110 rounds of boxing. One newspaper actually wrote, "The fistic carnival is over, it ended in murder," a sign of the growing sentiment that the sport needed to become safer. The fight though stands alone in boxing history as the longest official boxing match on record under modern rules. To this day, no other gloved bout has come close to that number of rounds or length, and hopefully it never will. This fight certainly is a historical and cautionary tale of the sport. The Bowen-Burke Marathon was often cited by reformers who argued that no boxing match should be allowed to go on that long. The marks of Queensberry rules were fully embraced in subsequent years, including provisions that prevented these indefinite endurance contests, and the era of 100-round fights faded into history. It hasn't prevented the mythical status of this fight, however, remembered not for its technique or excitement, but for its inhuman levels of endurance and punishment. Over 130 years later, we remember Andy Bowen and Jack Burke's epic endurance test as a legend of the ring, a fight that honestly defies belief. The story of the longest boxing match will always endure, much like the 2 men who refused to fall before each other. It remains one of the most extraordinary events in sporting history. 110 rounds of fury, never to be repeated.